Hello, everyone. So it's my great honor and pleasure to introduce you Professor Jack Edwards from NC State. Professor Edwards holds the Angel Family Professorship of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering MAE at NC State University and currently serves as the Director of Aerospace Research. Professor Edwards received his bachelor, master, and PhD degree all from NC State and joined the faculty in 1994. And in 2016 to 2020, he was also the associate department head and director of undergraduate program in the MAE department at NC State. He is a leading expert in CFD algorithm development, simulation modeling of turbulent flows, and simulation modeling, reacting, and multi-phase flow, especially high-speed supersonic combustion research. His current research include LES of turbulent combustion within high-speed aero-propulsion device, modeling of hypersonic wall-bounded flow, scramjet, fuel injector, contaminant transport due to human motion, and GPU-based high-performance computing. He's a fellow of AIAA and is the author or co-author of over 250 technical publications. His research efforts have been supported by a lot of federal agencies like AFOSR, ARO, ONR, US EPA, DARPA, DTRA, NSF, and Sandia Lab and AFRL, and many, many others. So today, Professor Edwards is going to talk about a very new and innovative topic about multi-resolution analysis, MRA, for assessment of turbulent combustion models for LES. Basically, a lot of traditional LES model for turbulent combustion can be evaluated by this very innovative method, and new models can be generated from that. So let's listen to the wonderful talk of Professor Edwards.
All right, great. Thanks so much for inviting me. And it's a real pleasure to be here and be able to present some of this work to you guys. Yeah, the title is Multi-Resolution Analysis for Assessment of Turbulent Combustion Models. And let me kind of push ahead to the next slide. So this work has been on and off for several years. It actually started with AFOSR support, and then it was matured under Army support, and we're currently we're starting to restart this effort under a NASA fellowship support to Paige Drummond. So she's going to be working on aspects of MRA for high-speed scramjet type combustion problems. But the basic premise of this is that with finite rate chemistry or direct quadrature methods for LES are becoming more practical. And that's because obviously we have more computing power. We also have a lot of effort on accurate, smaller scale reaction mechanisms. And over the years, people have developed very efficient ways of integrating rate equations, as well as strategies that can reduce the expense of direct quadrature for implicit methods. And the point about a DQ method, finite rate chemistry type approach, is that the flame structure doesn't have to be predetermined. You can essentially, it will evolve as part of the calculation. And because of that, you can get the non-equilibrium effects more precisely, which is, extinction, reignition, et cetera. But the challenges are obvious is in a sense that for the problem of accounting for the effects of unresolved data on what I term the apparent reactivity that you observe at the grid scale that you're trying to calculate the problem at is still uncertain. No one really knows how to do this. And another fact, obviously, is that the flame structures are almost always under resolved. So when you're doing a direct quadrature approach, you have to realize that there's a first order impact of numerical transport as well as the model transport mechanisms on what you observe. But we're going to focus really on the unresolved fluctuations aspect of it in this talk. And you could go through the history and you can see several direct quadrature methods developed. One is the very simplest thing. We call it laminar chemistry. We just evaluate the chemical source terms using the filtered mean data. You can go up a level to thickened flame models, and what a model I'll discuss in a minute called least squares minimization. You can take the hierarchy even further and do like an algebraic partially stirred reactor or eddy dissipation model. And then if you like to solve transport equations, you can go beyond that to say transport versions of PASR or DQ-MOM. You can go to stochastic approaches like LEM or ODT, and then finally maybe even to Eulerian or Lagrangian FDF. So basically the expense can go up pretty dramatically. The accuracy presumably can go up pretty dramatically as well, but then the problem is no one really knows how to quantify this, or really to develop new models that are more in tune with what we can on the average do today. A lot of these models were developed over generations in which the computing power was not what we have today, and a lot of things are modeled that maybe now don't have to be modeled. So it's not clear how you really develop new models or improve the ones we currently have to take advantage of this. So that's where MRA comes in. But I'll talk briefly about the challenges. Really start with sort of a priori analysis. This has been well known for many years, and it's been used extensively to develop models for subgrid scale transport. But the problem is a priori analysis doesn't really help you when you're trying to close chemical production terms. And the reasons are kind of like this. Essentially, you can always take a chemical production term and you can split it into something that produces a particular component, something that depletes it. And these guys are functions of the reaction rates, they're functions of et cetera, and they're very large in general. But the balance may not be so large. So you can essentially determine the sensitivities of these positive and negative reaction rates to compositions and temperature, and you can sort of quantify that, but you cannot really, from that, determine the effect on the balance very easily. So the bottom line is that the net production is much smaller. It's the difference of two very large terms, and it's much more going to be sensitive to fluctuations. So that's why you see, if you evaluate a chemical source term using filtered mean data and you compare it with the filtered chemical source term, you see this huge difference in the values. So that basically leads to uncertain conclusions. You don't really know how well the model is going to do because of this extreme nonlinearity, and really caused by the differences in large numbers. So that's where MRA comes in. Essentially, the premise is that you can construct or build simultaneous realizations of a turbulent flow, essentially using LES methods at different resolution levels. And when you constrain these realizations so that they're all driven by the finest resolution that you have, you can get a much more substantive effect of assessment of really the effects of what you're losing when you coarse grain the problem. So you have lots of data. You've got filtered fine mesh data. You've got evolved coarse mesh data available at each resolution level. And by using this, by using some statistical analysis tools that I'll discuss in a little bit, you can really identify some of the SGS effects and how they operate with mesh scale. So the early version that we came up with used two grids, and it was really devoted towards studying high-speed turbulent diffusion flames for scramjet type purposes. And we used that to develop a model which I'll call least squares or minimization, or LSM, which I'll discuss in a little bit. I'm going to show you some examples of that model. But what you have to do with MRAs, you have to correlate eddy structures among the mesh levels. So there are probably lots of ways to do this, but what we've done is we've put a relaxation term onto the coarse mesh momentum term. We have a similar term in the energy equation as a work term. And essentially what you're trying to do is to relax the solution that you have on the coarse mesh to the filtered fine grid velocity field. And so we do this by putting a source term here. We have a time scale that you have to model. We chose to use this in some sense as an estimate of the local eddy turnover time based on an integral scale measure. So some of the details are here, and I'm not going to really go too much into that. But basically, we're constraining the coarse mesh solutions to follow the fine grid velocity field in some sense. Now, we transfer data between the mesh levels. So we have a general volumetric filtering operator that looks something like this. And if you say, okay, how do you apply this? Well, the first place we apply it is to calculate the velocity field on the coarse meshes, or have that constraining source term. So that's one thing, but we can also do different things with, for example, the chemical production rates. If we want to see what the filtered chemical production rate is at a certain grid level, on the fly, we can calculate this operator and calculate it. If we want to evaluate that thing using the filtered fine mesh data, we can do that by, again, filtering the fine mesh data. If we want to evaluate the source term using the field data that we're evolving on a particular coarse grid, in other words, the laminar chemistry assumption using that set of data instead of the fine grid data, you can do that. And if you want to apply a model for this term on a coarse grid, you can do that as well. So you have all these degrees of freedom within MRA as to how you wish to sort of transfer information between the mesh levels. You can also do this for transport. If you don't like your favorite transport subgrid model, you could actually calculate what it should be from the fine grid, and you can impose it as a constraint on the coarse mesh solution. We can do this, but it turns out that what we found, after going through a lot of this over the years, we found out that the best results that we get, or the most useful results we get, are when we only really constrain the coarse meshes by the fine grid velocity field. So we call that velocity coupling, and all the results you're going to see, just use that. So that's kind of the idea. So some of the features of the framework is that the person who uses it can specify the number of mesh levels. They can also specify how many realizations they wish to perform per mesh level, and on any realization you could put in your favorite TCI, turbulence kinetic chemistry model, at that point. You can also put in the desired interaction exchange. If you wish to do like find a coarse transfer, find a medium, or whatever, you can define that as well. So there's some things we do with parallel processing just to make things straightforward, and I won't really discuss too much in detail, but one of the things we do is we time couple the solutions. So we have a sub-iteration sequence that will, at each physical time step, basically make the solutions evolve in tandem. And you can do this essentially by transferring information within the subsets, substeps, or after each sub-iteration sequence. The results really don't change a lot depending on what you choose here. And we're currently working on building this mesh hierarchy automatically based on the fine grid input. So that's something that's in progress with the new start of this stuff. So here's an example of a mesh hierarchy. Let's say you've got this fine grid here, and then you've generated 3 coarser grids, 3 medium level grids, and maybe 3 coarser grids, each one of which you're putting in a different subgrid model, for example. So you could basically have this set of data be driven by this fine grid velocity field. You could also filter this data to the coarse grids and have these 3 realizations driven by, again, a filtered version of the fine grid velocity field. You could do the same thing here. You could say, okay, I'll let one of my medium grid be an independent realization of all of this. So that one can drive, again, coarse grids, and you could finally have a coarse grid independent realization sitting by itself and use that data, again, for comparative purposes. So you've got a lot of degrees of freedom, and the user can set up this framework any way they desire. So the test case I'm going to show basically all my results from are a case we did with one of the Sydney bluff body flames. This one is one of the HM1E. It's very well characterized and very well used in the literature. It's a H2CH4 fuel mixture, and we use this particular kinetics mechanism. And these are some of the other parameters of this particular flow. And this is kind of an example of the local meshes in a little more detail. You've got your fuel injector here, you've got your bluff body. The fine grid has about 100 million cells, and then we coarsen by factors of 8 until we get to a 1.6 million cell for the coarse mesh realization. And so we did a bunch of validation. We did some various boundary condition effects and stuff I'm not going to really go into detail with here. But we did set up at least 3 different kinds of MRA hierarchies, where we had, for example, the fine grid was driving 3 medium grids, 3 coarse grids, different boundary condition here, and then some other variations on that theme. So I'm going to kind of show results really from one of these realizations, where the fine grid had a medium and a coarse underlying data. So this is some of the data comparison stuff. Again, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but it does show that there are some sensitivities to the boundary conditions on how you impose the flow, and they do affect the solution. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that. I will show a little scatter shot of some of the data predictions. I think the major problem that we saw with this case was the fact that we really underestimated, for whatever reason, the CO to CO2 conversion in the vicinity of the bluff body flame holder. We also had some problems in the necking region of the flame, but overall the results weren't terrible, and they're kind of in the line with what people see for this particular flame. This kind of shows you the coupling effect. So here's your fine grid solution. Here's the medium one, and here's the coarse one. As you can see, they're very similar because they've been coupled with regard to the velocity field. So when you take the time averages, you also see similarity. They're not going to be grossly different with one another because, again, you're constraining the coarse mesh solutions to sort of track the fine grid data. So what do we do to get the data out of this? Well, what we did for this study is we pulled out 585 coarse mesh locations, and then from that we pulled the neighborhood data that surrounded that location out as well. So each coarse mesh location had a bunch of face and vertex and edge neighbors, so we pulled all that data out. And because this is part of a mesh hierarchy, you've got medium mesh level data that lives below that, and you've got fine grid data that lives even further below that. So we could extract all of this data out of there and then figure out sort of how to use it to discover the connections that among the scales. So that's kind of the database that we're going to be analyzing and the results I'm going to show. So this is some results from that analysis. The first of all is a question: is the finest mesh fine enough to serve as a truth model? Is it a DNS? Well, no, it's not a DNS. It's basically, we could do the standard analysis, say the Kolmogorov scale estimate versus the Reynolds number. The slope is -1/2. It's not -3/4. So you're catching the outer parts of the dissipative scales, but you're not resolving down into the Kolmogorov scales for this particular problem. So is it a DNS? No, but it's still in the dissipative range. So we assume that this fine mesh LES is going to be fine enough to serve as a reasonable truth model for what we're going to try to discover. You can scatter plot some other things. For example, if you look at the velocity field and you compare the filtered data versus the evolved data, because they're tightly constrained, you see good agreement, not much scatter. When you go to the temperature, a reactive scalar, then suddenly the scatter starts to broaden, which you would expect. And also you start to see influences of the mesh size. So you're going to lose ability to capture the fine grid data as you coarsen the grid. Now, when you go to like a reactive, like a production term or a chemical source term or a heat release term, then the scatter becomes off the charts. You really can't directly correlate those data very well, so you have to come up with some other ways to kind of quantify that. So this is one way we tried. Essentially, we look at the ratio of the filtered, a norm of the filtered production rate vector with what you would get if you evaluate that using evolved data on one of the coarse meshes. Okay, so that guy, if you were perfect agreement, that ratio would be 1. So what we do is we basically sample this and we construct a PDF of that number. And we're coloring it with Dam-Kohler number as well. So the visual observation on this is pretty simple. If you had a perfect subgrid model, you would collapse around this black line. But when you don't have that, you see some deviations. And what we quantify from this kind of scatter plot is that essentially what you're doing is that your laminar chemistry evolution is basically over predicting reactivity. Okay, so the SGS effects effectively are taking away, attenuating reactivity, especially at higher Damkohler number. And it's more probable, obviously, as you go to the coarser grids. So you see this large scatter too, which is again something to talk about later. Another thing you can get out of this database is sort of an estimate of scale similarity. So people, you wonder whether reactive measures of reactivity develop any kind of scale similar properties. So what we did to kind of assess this, we basically defined a normalized Damkohler number, and essentially we have a neighborhood of data. So we normalize this Damkohler number over the neighborhood, calculate the Damkohler number this way, and then we try to determine, okay, how scale similar is this quantity in the neighborhood of a particular point? So what we can do from that is we can develop a single point, single time Fdfs. These essentially are what's shown here at different time locations and different space locations. And then we can kind of compare with a classical distribution, for example, a beta PDF. And the answer is sort of like, yeah, for this particular problem, you can pretty well quantify the local, this local FTF with a beta form. And then we kind of decided, okay, well, how does this extend to scale similarity? Can you show that for this MRA hierarchy, that the data is in fact self-similar with regard to this measure? And so we did the same thing. We just expanded the database to basically allow us to calculate the FDF. And we could see that, in fact, there was a structural similarity. And not only that, it is describable by a classic beta PDF type form, which is maybe somewhat surprising, but maybe not, because this, again, is a classical non-premixed flame. So it should, some measure, for example, mixture fraction, would certainly be describable very well by a beta PDF. This is kind of showing you that extends to a reactive measure as well. Another thing we could pull out of this sort of relates to PASR models, and that's the question of whether the reactivity is concentrated in the smallest scale structures that we can resolve. So I'm not going to go into this thing in too much detail. It's rather complicated to explain, but basically what we're showing here is the PDF of the heat release versus a measure of the eddy size, which we use as the swirl strength. And what we're showing here is kind of the peak in heat release is concentrated really in the dissipative range of the spectrum, of what we can resolve of the spectrum. And that's this green line, which really shows your inverse, the PDF of the inverse distant dissipative range timescale. But the point is that it's not really strongly peaked here. You know, if you don't really see like a very narrow peak of this heat release distribution in the dissipative ranges. You've got scale to scale interactions that's sort of pushing the reactivity into larger scales. And that's kind of what we were trying to find out. The PASR assumption is partially valid, but not wholly valid. So the question is, okay, now that you've got the framework, how do you use it to evaluate closure forms? And how potentially could you use the data to develop optimized or modified versions that may give better performance? So the measures are pretty straightforward. You've got filtered data for the chemical production term that you can pull from your fine grid. You've got similar data for heat release that you can pull from your fine grid. And then you've got various models for turbulence, subgrid models that you can apply at the coarser grids. So the question is, how do you compare these two in a quantitative sense to determine potentially which model is the best or how one could improve it? So we've done really two relatively, for the same data set, we've done two analyses of this. One is from a model called LSM, which I'll describe briefly. And another is for a set of algebraic PASR models that people have used fairly recently to model turbulent combustion. So these are relatively simple models. They're not the most sophisticated, but it does show you some differences that you can show out of MRA. But this, again, these are very, very nonlinear functions. So it makes no sense to like scatter plot these data directly. You've got to come up with a more creative way, I think, to analyze these to get some benefit. So what is LSM? Well, this is something we developed a few years ago, and it's a very simple closure. You start with laminar chemistry, you multiply it by this flow dependent factor, and then you get your model for the filtered production rate. So the model FLSM is shown here. It's essentially a least squares minimization of a functional that describes the reactivity. So we tested this guy, and I'll show you a few snapshots of results. And it's a reasonable, but in many cases, a modest improvement in predictive capability. So the question is, can MRA kind of help us improve this model, or can it show some differences among the variants? So that's the question I'm asking here, is that can you use the database to predict which LSM variant might best resolve the problem we're trying to answer? And I'm showing you several variations. One is an exact solution. In other words, if you had the data available from the fine grid mesh, you put that into this term, then you get the correct 100% least squares minimization solution. That should be very good. And then you've got various modeled alternatives where you estimate this term using resolve scale data, which is going to have error. So there are going to be some things here. Then you could maybe average the problem in a more maybe a more sophisticated sense, using some of this information that we showed earlier with regard to the distribution of the normalized Damkohler number. So this effectively is a different way of averaging or filtering the resolve scale data. So does MRA sort of help you determine which of these is the best? Well, the answer for the exact solution is that it's great, right? But this is impractical, because in a practical model, you won't have the data to deal with. Laminar chemistry is here. Again, the idea is to push toward this black line. LSM, one of the versions of LSM, you could say it's improving a little bit. It's pushing you a little closer to that line. And then the Damkohler number version that we came up with pushes you even more closely. But the bottom line is that you really are not attenuating or changing the scatter. So you really can't say that any of these models are precisely telling you much about the subgrid effects. So that's a conclusion that we sort of drew. Now this goes to a coarser grid. This is the medium grid. So the previous results were the coarse grid. Medium grid, everything improves because, again, you're resolving more of the turbulence and the chemistry interactions, but still you see some deficiencies in the LSM models. They're not going to really capture the scatter of this very well. Now, the bottom line here, this is normalized source term, essentially a Damkohler number type description. How about PASR? Well, PASRs can be as sophisticated as you like. What I'm writing in the first equation is sort of a multi-level PASR type description, where you basically are representing different reactive environments with different volume fractions. So you take a mesh cell, you partition it in some way among volumes of structure, and then you try to account for interchanges among those different sizes of structures. So you basically have a transport term, you have an interchange term, which assumes sort of a triadic interaction, and then you've got the chemical production rate for your particular scale. Now you can start with this, and then you can do some assumptions. Assume, for example, subgrid transport normal to the surface. You can neglect the convective part, and you assume a certain topology for your SGS structure, which is like a worm-like, filament-like topology. And if you just look at three mesh levels, or three maybe environment levels, where you have an outer environment, you have an environment that's associated with the grid scale where you're trying to solve the problem, and then you've got maybe a level below that in which your dissipative scales are active, you can basically take this form and you can convert it to an algebraic closure. So this is like a 3-level or 3-environment PASR model. And I'll show you maybe some results from one version of this in a little bit. Now, what PASR models want to do is they want to close the problem by basically specifying the volume fraction of the finest scale structures. So if you say, okay, I don't care about this outer environment, I'm going to simplify these two terms together, then basically I end up with the classical or standard algebraic PASR form. So your closure for the subgrid is this, but you have to solve this balance equation at the subgrid level to get the data to push into your closure model. Now, the balance equation is shown here. What I'm highlighting with the boxes are really the data that you're giving to it as the truth. This is what's driving the solution. So there's some differences in, for example, for MRA, how you wish to compute these terms. But what I'm really more highlighting is the fact that within the literature, there are lots of variations in how people have modeled this time scale, which is like an interchange with the mean term, and also this fine scale volume fraction, which is alpha 2. Now, Sabelnikov and Furby, I think Christopher Furby's probably done most of the, a lot of recent work on PASR in Europe. And they have a prescription that they've used for a lot of relatively complicated, reactive flow problems, lots of scramjet work and some other areas as well. So I'm kind of highlighting his choices of terms, how they define their time scale and how they define their volume fraction in my notation. So that's what this is. You'll note that his model has the laminar flame speed. So you have to give their model a number for this, and that's obviously a reactive influence to the problem. Now, there's some older PASR models. There's Magnussen's eddy dissipation concept, which again I'm putting in my notation here. And then there's a relatively comprehensive study by Giacometti, and they did some fractal-based estimates of some of these terms. And so we tried that one as well. Now, another thing we get out of the MRA analysis is essentially these models, we're basically trying to come up with a better statistical way of describing the reactivity influences. So what we settled on for this study, which was again done a little bit later than the LSM study, is to try to come up with a joint PDF of the Dam-Kohler number defined like this, and the turbulence Reynolds number defined like it's used in the PASR models. So we can take the MRA database and we can basically do, get this joint PDF. And from that, you can tell some things about resolution. You can tell some things, for example, that this resolution is pretty good, certainly on the medium mesh. You see a peak in the distribution near low Reynolds number values, which is kind of telling us that we're still pretty well resolved, even on the medium mesh. When you go to the coarser mesh, you start to see more of a broadening of that effect. And you also see that the most probable Dam-Kohler numbers, according to this definition, are relatively small. So the flow is essentially near equilibrium or non-reactive in large parts of the domain. So the finite rate chemistry effects are really the higher Dam-Kohler number values, which are captured, but they're not the most probable values. So we can use this distribution to kind of assess some of these other reactive scalar measures. And one of the ones we did which is, I think, kind of nice, is that we go back to our fundamental measures of production rate norm ratio. Perfect SGS closure, these are the same. This norm is 1, the log of it's 0. You can also look at heat release. How is the heat release distributed over this Reynolds number, Dam-Kohler number space? So here we take the conditional heat release measure, conditional average, and we multiply it by the joint PDF itself. So that localizes the effect to where it's most probable, where the most probable data is. So this is kind of an eye chart, but it's pretty important because you've got a bunch of models here, and you've got the exact solutions at the top coming out of the fine grid data. So visually, you can almost pinpoint right off the bat which of these models is doing the best. If you look at reactive source term, the model here, which we call Magnussen CGC, obviously is doing the best. It's closer to what we observe here. Now, the CGC actually is this 3-environment model. It's this including a coupling with the outer scale. So the rest of these guys don't do that. But that does show you that potentially by doing a 3-environment PASR, you get some benefit. Some of the other guys, it's hard to say really which is better. The Furby result here kind of stands out on the medium grid as not being very good. But if you look at heat release, it's not terrible. So the heat release measure and this measure don't necessarily have to be in lockstep as far as the model performance is concerned. So, it's hard to say other than the baseline PASR forms aren't super great for this particular problem. So how can you optimize them? So this is kind of the last couple of slides. And what we kind of know for algebraic PASR, it's not really these terms independently that matter. It's the product. So you can look at trying to optimize this product to get better answers. Now the time scale is a little bit more clear. It's coming out of classical, turbulent spectrum theory. And you can do different models depending on what you decide your dissipative range scaling is. So we can do that, and we can pin that one down, at least within some uncertainty. But the one that no one really knows how to deal with is this volume fraction distribution. So that's something you're not going to be able to model very precisely, or you don't have a good idea of what that is. So what we just tried to do is we tried to regress out based on the data that we have from MRA. We tried to regress out what this actually should be. And we did this obviously by minimizing the difference between the model prediction and the exact solution over the domain, over this Damkohler Reynolds number space, and also over the two grid levels that we had. So these are showing you sort of an eye chart of what the answers are. So this essentially that you're getting out of this is the distribution of this 0 to 1 volume fraction as a function of Damkohler number and Reynolds number. And it looks like the Taylor scale parameterization for the time scale looks a little more consistent. I mean, you're seeing a little bit of scale similarity here. The other ones maybe not so much, or they're not quite as clear. But certainly you could take any of these distributions and you could try to model it. And that's kind of what we do. So we took the Taylor distribution because that was the one that showed the most obvious scale similarity. We basically just fitted this with a very simple parameterization and also fitted the time scale based on our data. The thing you kind of know is that there is a reactivity dependence here in this estimate of the volume fraction. Magnussen's model doesn't have this. Giacomozz's model doesn't have this. Only Sabelnikov's and Furby's model incorporates some measure of reactivity in terms of the laminar flame speed. So we find that that's essential. You've got to have that to get a better distribution. So basically, this is the regressed version, and this is our model version. So then the question is, how does this model version do with respect to the data? This basically is another view of these slides. The only thing we're doing differently is that we're integrating this distribution over the PDF of the Reynolds number, over that marginal PDF. So effectively, we get data versus Damkohler number. And if you look again, the truth model are look for one of these charts, for example, the truth model here is the dotted line. So for the production norm, it's 0 because the log of 1 is 0. For the heat release measure, it's again some amalgamation of the Reynolds number effects. And so you're getting this distribution that peaks again toward higher values of the Damkohler number. And you can see the model predictions here. The outliers are really a couple. There's laminar chemistry, which for reasons we discussed earlier, isn't going to do particularly well when you use filtered data, but it's not terrible when you evaluate laminar chemistry using the evolved data. And you also see that Furby's model is a bit of an outlier here. It doesn't do particularly well on the medium grid, which we showed earlier. Now, this is the optimal one. So if you go in and you regress out the optimal version of the volume fraction, then suddenly the scatter kind of disappears. You're actually modeling it pretty well here. Same thing is true on the coarser grid. The results are worse for most models, with the exception of Furby's, which actually improves. And then when you push in the optimal volume fraction distribution, suddenly the results collapse pretty well around the data. So, in a nutshell, this is kind of showing you the potential of something like MRA to sort of help you decide between models and also potentially to improve a model. So that's what I'll conclude with, is we've developed this technique for sort of on-the-fly assessment of model influences. We're focusing, again, mostly on closures for the reactive source terms. So not like transport, et cetera, but it could be used for transport models as well. We do this by constraining our coarse mesh realizations by the fine grid velocity field. We could do things like we could constrain by transport or even chemistry, but we don't do that anymore. We're strictly constraining by the velocity field. We've tested this guy for the Sydney flame, one of the Sydney flames. We've compared with data, and then we've gone into the hierarchy and tried to pull out information that lets us assess scale effects on measures of reactivity. So I showed you some examples of that. And then we took the data to try to assess a couple of models for TCI that are relatively simple. One's LSM and the other's an algebraic PASR format. And based on the model assessment, you could say that the LESM models have a certain level of ability, but beyond that, it's going to be a challenge to make them much better. You can get slightly better improvement by using this alternative distribution to average over, but they're still missing some of the key effects, especially at lower Damkohler number. Now, the PASR models aren't much better. They don't perform particularly well in their baseline forms. And this, again, is a very set up so that they're using fine grid data to constrain the PASR system. So they should do pretty well, but they really don't. But they do improve if you couple with an outer environment, this 3-environment PASR that I discussed. That may be useful for future work. But one thing you can do is you can optimize or regress out optimal timescale volume fraction distributions that potentially could perform much better. Again, this is for one case, so they perform better for one case. But this does kind of tell you what you could potentially do. It does appear to be important to kind of distinguish between lower Damkohler number effects that might be due to attaining partial equilibrium or partially steady state balances versus those that are just non-reactive. So I think it should be easy enough to pull out the non-reactive parts from this measure. Again, these results are just from one database that we've done and worked with in detail. So you can't really necessarily take these results and go try them just yet. So what are we trying to do now? Again, we were not working on this for a while. It's been sort of stop and start for the last few years. So what we're doing now is we're pushing in a more general MRA platform that has a lot less burden on the user to set things up. And the one thing we really want to do is to kind of do some of these analyses that I just showed, these sort of PDF-based analyses on the fly, as opposed to having to pull the data out in a post-processor, to kind of come up with these maps of reactive measures versus Reynolds number, Damkohler number, sample space on the fly as an outcome would be really useful. We are going to test some other models. For example, thickened flame models are really easy to kind of code up and test using MRA. And hopefully we'll be able to put some improved model forms as into the hierarchy and actually test them out on the fly to see how well they do. There is a potential, again, for like using some of this coupling technology to enable embedded DNS or LES, and that's something, again, we could pursue. But our initial focus is really these first four things. Again, focusing mostly on higher speed combustion, scramjet, ramjet type problems in which it's not obvious at all what kind of turbulence chemistry interaction model one would want to use. So with that, I'll conclude, and I'll be happy to take any questions you might have. I see some in the chat, and I'll try to get to those once I stop sharing.
Okay, so thanks, Professor Edwards, very much for the very nice talk. And we have a bunch of questions in the chat, so I go over them, and Professor Edwards can talk about them. The first one comes from Professor Jay Guo. he asked, relatively earlier in your presentation, you showed that the simulation do not capture and generally underestimate the CO to CO ratio. Have you examined this in more detail to figure out the cause and the exact relationship for the difference, maybe from MRA?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we did not go in more detail with this. The whole set of our Sydney flame simulations are kind of sensitive to what we do for trying to stir up the turbulence in the inflow and also what we do in the boundary conditions. So we saw an influence on that, on the CO2 to CO ratio. But we never really figured out exactly the right prescription that would change that. And certainly the kinetics, we've not really tried other kinetic schemes either. So that's one set of data for the kinetics that we use. It could be a problem with the kinetics. It could be a problem with the boundary conditions. It could be a problem with the boundary conditions at the surface of the bluff body. But we didn't spend much more time trying to delve into that, to be honest.
Yep. I have looked at this flame a little bit myself, and I agree with you that it may be related to the bluff body flame stabilization in particular.
Yeah.
That they may have higher temperatures in that region than our boundary condition specifications allow, and that leads to CO to CO2 conversion early in the flame, and that carries downstream. That's my impression as well. So thanks for the answer. I wanted to sort of seek your independent opinion. I agree with you.
That's the best I could come up with. We didn't go further than that, unfortunately.
Thank you.
So, yep.
The second question comes from myself. Is Furby's PASR method limited to premixed combustion as it requires laminar flame speed? Actually, Professor Cole has some comments.
Yeah, no, it's not according to them. But they do have to pull this out of somewhere. So my question has always been, because as SFL is not necessarily a universal parameter, you have to make some choices as to what you define to be SFL, but they use this pretty routinely for non-premixed systems. But exactly how they determine under what conditions SFL, the laminar flame speed, is not clear to me.
Yeah, I think if you go into the depths of how they developed the model and where the Furby model, their own argument, not necessarily agreeing with, but what they have presented is that combustion is always consisting of a premixed portion and a non-premixed portion, and somehow they are able to estimate what part is premixed and what part is non-premixed. So then they parameter that gets evaluated based on turbulence, kinetic energy, dissipation rate, etc., that says a certain fraction is premixed, another fraction is non-premixed, and that's how they determine the reaction rate. And the laminar flame speed does not apply to the non-premixed part. They utilize a mixture fraction-based approach for the non-premixed part and a laminar flame speed-based approach for the premixed part.
Okay.
But it is empirical, and certainly that's a source of limitations of the model for sure.
Right. Yeah, they're probably over the years they have done a lot of different things with that model. So it's you're right. There's been variations. I can't remember which one I pulled to actually analyze, but it was one that had Sabelnikov as a co-author on it, and he did have the laminar flame speed, but they were trying it for scramjets and stuff, so it wasn't clear how they were evaluating that guy.
Maybe it's from the triple flame structure for the flame stabilization scramjet, I guess.
It could be, yeah. I don't remember exactly the particular application, but they use that particular version a lot. And they use it sort of as their standard approach.
Yeah, they publish a lot.
Positive feature is stability. Somehow it does not tend to blow up the production rates.
True. It does.
Sort of counteracts and brings it back to stability.
It does. It's sort of a change between, like, mixing. Yeah, it's some balance between equilibrium and fully mixed out. So it's just, kind of magic that it works. So.
Yeah.
So the other questions, I guess.
Yeah. The next question also from me. Yeah. So I think is the least square method basically is a regression way to get the volume fraction.
Yeah.
It seems data dependent, right? So I try to see how general it could be.
I would suggest not general.
Okay. Okay.
Totally data dependent.
Yeah.
I just wanted to see if it was possible to regress this out and see it actually work in a sense but that particular case is just for one particular flame. So we have no idea that whether that parameterization would work in general.
Okay. Actually, Professor Jago said because you are using you are using non-dimensional numbers and the non-dimensional variable in that regression, maybe that can help the generalization.
I think that's what you would want, right? You'd want to be able to define consistent measures of Dam-Kohler, consistent measures of Reynolds number. The Dam-Kohler number obviously is a lot of variations in how you choose to do that, but you could potentially calibrate a model using some selection of that, and maybe it would be general enough, but you don't really know until you
until we test many different flames. Yeah.
Right. That was one of the things we never got around to doing, was taking this model and putting it in a semi-production code and actually seeing if it did better in a real production sense.
Right.
I guess the hybrid Fury model we answered that already, and this one has no consideration of progress variable. This particular version.
Okay.
It's strictly the LSM can be improved. I don't know. I think LSM it's got some merits, but it's a very quick and dirty answer to that problem. I've not figured out a way to improve it further.
Okay. Yeah. So there's no more question in the chat, but I probably have more questions. So so currently I see you use MRA to evaluate different SGS models, and also could possibly improve some of them based on the findings.
Right.
The other idea I'm thinking is because MRA, you can also get the cross-scale flux evaluation. Maybe you can use that to better quantify the exchange term in the, say, for example, generalize the PASR models.
Yeah,
that's
maybe
another direction.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think I kind of like that 3-environment model in terms of how much it improves and how much it actually seems to have more of a. The algebraic models they simplify it so dramatically. You're not going to get really the scale-to-scale interchanges really modeled very well. So if I were going to play with this further, I might look more at that 3-environment type coupling. The only challenge, of course, is that involves nonlinear systems solved at 3 different resolution levels. So you're solving this reaction diffusion problem coupled at 2 different scales. So your cost benefits got to balance out, right? You're going to spend twice the work than standard PASR. So you're hoping to see a tangible benefit in that. And it's not clear that would happen, but you wouldn't know till you try, right?
Yeah.
But I agree with you. I think that kind of model has a lot of potential, and especially for an algebraic model, no transport equations. But it would cost you a lot. It wouldn't be cheap.
Yeah, so the major difference between the 3-environment model and the traditional PASR is this is like a 3-level. The traditional is like a 2-level, right?
Yeah, the traditional is really 2-level, but you only have to solve for interchanges between your grid scale and the dissipated scale.
Right.
So with the 3 environment, you've got a higher level as well, a coarser structure scale. You have to couple those together. So it involves really 2 sets of environment data you have to populate, plus the one you solve at the filtered, the one you actually extract from your simulation. You'd have 2 underlying sets of reactive scalar data that you'd have to solve for. So 3 in total, 2 for standard PASR.
Okay. So how much benefits do you think introduce transported equation for this could give? I mean, of course it's expensive, but
it's expensive, and we've tried it for standard PASR with transport. I won't say it's not, it's certainly workable, and I think it has potential to do that, but again, it's a cost benefit question as to whether it's worth solving. If you're solving in species transport equations for your main filtered variables, you're going to solve in more for these subfilter variables. So that's the question: is it worth that extra doubling of the cost to get some benefit? And that's why I kind of like LSM in some sense. Even though it doesn't provide that much benefit, it does provide some, and it's cheap. What you'd like is something that's also cheap that provides more benefit, right?
Right. Yes.
So that's sort of where we are with this.
So Jack, I enjoyed your talk. So I think that this and multi-grid size, multi-resolution approach should be the direction in the future as the computation power and the data learning algorithms prevail.
Right.
My comment is that I like the idea you have this 2 grids and try to build a model between them, but it's highly dependent, as you said, depending on the chemistry, depending on the turbulence. And I think why not on these days just using embedded DNS? I mean that if you can capture fluids with turbulence.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think the embedded DNS in one sense, MRA kind of helps you, because in the other sense, the harder part is going from the coarse to fine. Like, how do you do that interchange? How you make the fine grid affect the coarser realization is sort of what we figured out with MRA, but the other direction, I don't know how to do that. How do you basically create the scales that form your fine, that would be resolvable on your finer grid? That's where the challenge, I think, comes in with embedded DNS myself.
Yeah, I understand. But in fluid mechanics field, right, people have been doing this. Try to communicate between multiple, different timescales.
Sure.
But my point is clear that the main thing in combustion, right, omega, that mostly happen at a very high temperature, and particularly for propulsion environment. So therefore, the viscosity actually that time at that temperature actually very high. Very limited situation that turbulence can penetrate really that reaction zone. And so I see that there's a great idea of opportunity that to simplify this problem, just focus on embedded DNS near the flame front, and then everything else is rely on traditional fluid LES type of solver. I think that with today's this computational power, I think that should be the good direction to go, right?
I agree with you. Yeah, I agree with you.
Highly variable viscosity is the underline there, though. You'd have to track the highly variable viscosity. Viscosity variation with temperature, you'd have to track, right?
Yeah. All right. I'm good. And so
yes. So I just try to seek the opinion. So in general, how much the embedded DNS will do beyond just AMRs? I mean, I know there are some additional work we need to do, but just try to see
MR so far, I think that most of the concept is based on compressible flow or turbulence, right? I mean, mostly compressive flow. They try to resolve shock waves, the density gradient. But embedded DNS probably have more criteria in terms how you resolve that the reaction.
Yeah, but the newest AMR already considered that. They just added the criteria to the AMR.
That's what I'm saying. So
yes, yes. But
yeah, the question is sometimes you can refine the grid, but it doesn't mean you populate those scales.
Yeah.
Right. So you could have a really fine grid, but somehow if you don't have enough time or enough ability to generate the slower scales that you should capture, it may not be any point.
Yeah.
That's what I've seen like in two-phase flows. We do some AMR for two-phase flows, and you would hope it would do better, but really it doesn't necessarily do it unless there's a generation mechanism for that finer scale to be there. And that's what I don't think I know how to do, and I don't know if anyone does.
Yeah, the time scale is another issue that even though your grid scale is there, but in
the grid scale, the time scale's got to drop too, right?
Yeah.
And
so that's why the data science comes in. So when you have time scale issue, you can how do you extrapolate that from getting information from larger resolution from the fine resolution, right? So that is the interesting area.
Yep, I agree. I've seen some decent work on that, and I've never really delved into it, but that is a very important issue.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, I think another benefit is even if the phase mesh do not resolve what we need, the multi-level MRA can tell us, MRA tell us the difference between the fine and the intermediate and the coarse. And if we have a self-similarity, we can use that information to infer if we further refine the fine mesh, what correction we need, and that can be used to even correct the fine mesh results in the say AMR solution, right? Just some brainstorm, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's hard to.
But it's nonlinear effect too, right? Like you need multiple levels to do that.
yes, yeah.
It's good, and combustion made a lot of progress in this kind of multi-scale modeling.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I don't have more questions or comments, but.
Good, exciting, and Jack, and I'm glad to see a lot of progress you have made and over the years. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you guys about it. Hopefully, we've got again back on the clock working on this, so hopefully we'll get some new results out.
Yeah. All right. Is Rolf still funding you, or
no? This Ralph, I don't think his program sort of vanished. So this was it's been picked up by NASA on a fellowship. So my student won a hypersonics fellowship, and her project is going to be to try to direct MRA towards some of their problems.
All right.
Scramjet type high-speed flows. And so most of the things we discussed at the end, we're going to try to do for some higher speed jet diffusion flames and maybe some cavity type flames.
All right. Okay. So, great. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Good afternoon.
Thanks, Jack. Yeah.